In every mansion, behind polished smiles and glittering chandeliers, lies a truth no one dares to speak. 17 years of loyalty, shattered in a single moment. Secrets that could destroy a family. And one woman who saw everything. Her name is Ruth, and her silence is about to speak. Welcome to Brinicle Reads, where we uncover the darkest truths behind the facades, and tell stories that will grip your mind and stir your soul. Today, we bring you the loyal employee. The woman who sees everything. They never asked Ruth Williams what she noticed. That was the first mistake. For 17 years, she arrived before the sun rose and left after the lights dimmed. The Hale mansion woke up to her footsteps and fell asleep to the sound of her locking doors. Marble floors memorized the pattern of her walk. Crystal chandeliers reflected her face more often than they reflected theirs. And yet, to the family, she was invisible. Ruth understood early that invisibility had rules. You speak softly. You move efficiently. You never linger where your presence might feel inconvenient. You learn when to disappear. The Hale mansion sat on a hill, white stone and glass stretching wide like it owned the horizon. It wasn't just a house. It was a statement. A declaration that money could replace warmth, that height could substitute for integrity. From the outside, people admired it. From the inside, Ruth cleaned fingerprints off truths no one wanted to acknowledge. Every morning, she polished surfaces that hid fractures. She knew which floorboard creaked outside Jonathan Hale's study. She knew which cabinet Eleanor slammed when she was angry but pretending she wasn't. She knew the difference between footsteps that meant confidence and footsteps that meant fear. You don't learn those things by being curious. You learn them by being necessary, and ignored. Jonathan Hale liked to say Ruth was like family. But families don't avoid eye contact when they lie. He said it at dinner parties, wine glass raised, smile sharpened just enough to look sincere. Ruth's been with us forever, he'd say. She knows this place better than anyone. And Ruth would nod. Smile politely. Say nothing. Because what he meant was, she knows her place. She wore the same neutral-colored uniforms every week, carefully pressed, always clean. Clothes designed to blend into walls. To never demand attention. To never interrupt conversations that weren't meant for her ears. But ears don't close just because mouths stop talking. Secrets are careless. They spill when people feel safe. They grow bold when they think no one important is listening. And in that house, Ruth was never considered important. She heard Jonathan pacing late at night, voice low, sharp, slicing through the quiet. She didn't need to hear the full sentences to recognize fear disguised as authority. She heard Eleanor crying behind bathroom doors, the sobs carefully muted, the makeup reapplied perfectly before stepping back into the world. She heard laughter that ended too suddenly. Silences that stayed too long. Ruth learned early that wealth didn't eliminate pain, it just upholstered it. The Hale family moved through their lives like actors who believed the set would never collapse. They trusted walls to keep secrets. They trusted money to absorb consequences. They trusted silence. And silence was Ruth's specialty. Not because she lacked words. Because she understood their weight. There was a way people spoke around her, sentences unfinished, tones careless. Conversations continued as if she weren't standing 3 feet away, adjusting flowers that didn't need adjusting. She was there when Jonathan boasted to his business partners, confident and careless, convinced the woman refilling glasses couldn't possibly understand what he was saying. She was there when Eleanor rehearsed her charity speeches out loud, practicing empathy like a foreign language. She was there when Lucas slammed his bedroom door and cursed under his breath, frustration leaking through the cracks of privilege. She was there when Madeline stared at her reflection for too long, eyes searching for something no one had taught her how to name. She was there when Henry stayed silent for days, his voice shrinking with each passing week. Ruth didn't collect secrets intentionally. They came to her. Like dust. And just like dust, she cleaned them up quietly. No one ever asked her how it felt to know so much about people who barely knew her last name. They didn't ask what it did to her heart to witness love performed instead of lived. To see loyalty demanded but never returned. They didn't ask because they assumed the answer didn't matter. Ruth learned something important about power in that house. Power wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It didn't need to announce itself. Power was the confidence to believe consequences were for other people. And the Hales had mastered that belief. Jonathan's office was Ruth's least favorite room. Not because it was dirty, he was meticulous about appearances, but because it smelled like control. Leather chairs. Dark wood. Framed photographs of deals celebrated and people forgotten. She dusted awards that praised his vision. She straightened documents that rewrote other people's futures. She noticed how his smile vanished the moment the door closed. How his shoulders dropped, how the mask loosened. That room didn't make him powerful, it reminded him of what he was afraid to lose. Eleanor's world was lighter. Brighter. Full of white and glass and carefully chosen softness. Every object placed to suggest peace. Every room designed to look lived in without actually being lived in. Ruth noticed how Eleanor avoided mirrors when she thought no one was watching. How her voice changed depending on who entered the room. How exhaustion settled into her bones despite the luxury surrounding her. Lucas treated the house like a stage. Like something temporary. He walked through rooms with inherited confidence, never questioning how the ground beneath him was secured. Ruth noticed how easily he dismissed people, how quickly his charm hardened when it wasn't rewarded. Madeline lingered. She lingered in doorways. In hallways. In conversations that weren't meant to include her. She watched Ruth sometimes. Really watched her. As if she suspected something others didn't. As if she knew that survival required observation before action. Henry barely made noise at all. The youngest always learns first that silence can be armor. Ruth saw all of this long before anyone suspected she noticed anything at all. Because noticing doesn't require permission. It requires patience. 17 years teaches you patience. 17 years teaches you which truths matter and which ones destroy. Ruth had seen other employees come and go. Some left quietly. Some were dismissed without explanation. Some cried. Some burned bridges. None of them were warned. The mansion swallowed people whole. And Ruth survived by becoming part of the structure. Load-bearing. Unnoticed. Essential. She never took photos. Never recorded conversations. Never wrote anything down. Her memory was enough. Every secret placed carefully in its own mental room. Locked. Catalogued. Untouched. Not because she planned to use them. But because she understood something the Hales never did. Truth doesn't disappear just because you ignore it. It waits. And waiting was something Ruth had learned how to do very well. On the day everything began to shift, though no one realized it yet, Ruth stood in the kitchen before dawn, staring out at the empty driveway. The house was still asleep. Vulnerable. Honest in its quiet. She felt it then. That subtle tension. That warning beneath routine. The kind that comes before a storm. She adjusted her apron. Took a slow breath. And went back to work. Because loyal women don't announce themselves. They watch. They remember. And when the world finally asks what they know, they already have the answer. The father's empire is built on blood. Ruth learned long ago that power has a sound. Not the sound people imagine, no shouting, no slammed doors. Power doesn't need to announce itself. Power whispers. It hums. It moves calmly, confidently, like it has nowhere urgent to be. Jonathan Hale's power sounded like late-night phone calls. They always came after midnight. The house would be asleep, lights dimmed, corridors still, the kind of quiet money buys when it believes it's earned rest. Ruth would be finishing the last of her work, rinsing the final glass, wiping the last counter, when she'd hear it. Footsteps. Measured. Certain. Jonathan's study light would flick on, slicing the dark hallway with a sharp line of gold. The door would close, not slammed, never slammed, just firm enough to mean privacy. And then his voice would change. Not louder. Lower. The voice of a man who knew no one in that room could stop him. Ruth never stood still to listen. That would have been careless. Instead, she worked. Moved naturally. Let sound come to her the way it always did. That project is finished, Jonathan would say. No, they won't fight it. Relocation costs are minimal if you move fast. Relocation. Such a gentle word. Ruth learned that powerful men loved gentle words. Words that made destruction sound like logistics. Words that softened the edges of harm until it looked like progress. Jonathan never raised his voice. He never sounded angry. That's what made it worse. Rage could be argued with. Calm certainty couldn't. Ruth remembered the first time she understood what those calls meant. It was years ago. Early in her employment. Back when she still believed rich people were just lucky, not deliberate. She'd been taking out trash when she overheard him say, "The zoning board is handled." Handled. 2 weeks later, she saw it on the news. A black neighborhood on the east side, homes generations old, churches built brick by brick, small businesses run by families who knew each other's children, was being redeveloped. Luxury condos. Mixed-use commercial space. Elevated living. Ruth stood in the staff kitchen watching the footage, her hands still wet from washing dishes. She recognized the street. She recognized the barber shop on the corner. The grocery store with the faded awning. The playground with the rusted swings. Her cousin had lived 3 blocks from there. Jonathan walked in mid-report, glanced at the screen, and smiled faintly. Good investment, he said, like he was commenting on the weather. That was when Ruth understood. Jonathan Hale didn't build things. He replaced them. And replacement always required removal. Over the years, the pattern repeated. Different cities. Different projects. Same method. Late-night calls. Quiet meetings. Regulatory shortcuts. Communities described as underutilized. Ruth learned what underutilized really meant. It meant poor. It meant voiceless. It meant replaceable. Jonathan spoke about families the way others spoke about outdated furniture. With mild annoyance. With entitlement. With the assumption that inconvenience was their fault for existing in his way. Once, during a dinner party, someone joked about protesters slowing down a development. Jonathan laughed. "They'll move on," he said. They always do. Ruth poured wine beside him, her hands steady, her face neutral. He never noticed the way her jaw tightened. He never noticed because men like Jonathan didn't look down. They looked forward. Toward profit. Toward legacy. Toward a future scrubbed clean of the people they stepped on. The study became a place Ruth dreaded. Not because of what she heard, but because of what she understood. The room smelled like leather and ambition. Awards lined the shelves. Framed magazine covers praised Jonathan as a visionary. A builder. A man who revitalized cities. Ruth dusted those frames carefully. Each one felt heavier than the last. She wondered how many families had packed their lives into boxes so those awards could exist. How many people had been told to be grateful for compensation that couldn't buy history back. Once, Jonathan ended a call and leaned back in his chair, exhaling. "Sometimes you have to be ruthless," he muttered to himself. Ruth was in the room then, wiping a side table. He hadn't noticed her enter. He looked up, startled, just for a second. Then the mask snapped back into place. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. Ruth met his gaze and shook her head. "No, sir." He studied her for a moment longer than usual. Measuring. Calculating. Then he smiled. Good. That smile lingered in her thoughts long after she left the room. Jonathan didn't fear exposure. He feared disruption. He feared anything he couldn't control. And Ruth, quiet, loyal, unassuming Ruth, fit neatly into his idea of safety. That was his second mistake. The first was assuming silence meant ignorance. The second was believing morality was something other people worried about. Ruth saw how Jonathan treated people when he thought nothing was at stake. The dismissive gestures. The clipped commands. The way he spoke about employees instead of to them. He paid well. On time. Generously, even. He believed money erased obligation. But Ruth had learned something different growing up. Money didn't erase debt. It documented it. One night, a call lasted longer than usual. Jonathan's voice sharpened. "No, that wasn't the agreement. You said the community board was neutralized. I don't care how you do it. Fix it. Fix it." Ruth stood in the hallway outside the study, frozen for just a second. She thought about her mother, who'd worked 3 jobs and still apologized for needing help. She thought about neighbors who shared food when money ran short. She thought about the way power moved without permission. And she thought about how easily Jonathan's voice could erase lives he'd never see. The call ended abruptly. Jonathan slammed his hand on the desk, rare, uncontrolled. Ruth stepped back silently, retreating before he opened the door. She didn't want to be seen in moments like that. She knew better. Over time, Ruth began to notice something else. Jonathan avoided certain news stories. Changed channels when protests appeared on screen. Scoffed at phrases like systemic injustice and corporate responsibility. People love to blame success, he once said. Easier than admitting failure. Ruth wanted to ask him whose failure he meant. But loyal employees don't ask questions. They listen. And listening revealed more than questions ever could. Jonathan's empire wasn't just built on money. It was built on confidence that consequences belonged to other people. On the belief that suffering was an acceptable byproduct of ambition. On the quiet assumption that some lives were worth less than others. Ruth didn't hate Jonathan. Hate required emotional investment. What she felt was colder. Clarity. She saw him exactly as he was, without the admiration, without the illusion. Just a man who confused power with permission. And that clarity changed the way she moved through the house. She cleaned his office with slower precision. She noticed which files stayed locked away. Which names repeated across documents. Which cities appeared again and again. She never took anything. She never needed to. Knowledge, once acquired, couldn't be stolen back. One afternoon, Madeline wandered into the study while Ruth was dusting. She picked up a framed photo of Jonathan breaking ground on a development, smiling with a shovel in his hands. "Do you think he knows?" Madeline asked suddenly. Ruth paused. "Knows what, miss?" Madeline stared at the photo. "What it costs." Ruth met her eyes. Some questions didn't require answers. Some truths didn't need confirmation. Madeline set the frame down carefully and left without another word. That night, Ruth lay awake longer than usual. Jonathan's voice echoed in her memory. Calm. Confident. Certain. She thought about blood, not the dramatic kind, not violence you could see, but the slow bleeding of opportunity. Of safety. Of home. She thought about how many people would never know Jonathan Hale's name, even as his decisions shaped their lives. And she understood something then. Empires didn't crumble because they were evil. They crumbled because they believed they were untouchable. Ruth turned on her side and closed her eyes. She wasn't planning anything. She didn't need to. Because truth had a way of surfacing on its own. And when it did, it would remember who had been watching all along. The mother who smiles for cameras. Eleanor Hale was loved by people who didn't know her. That was her greatest achievement. She smiled the way magazines taught women to smile, chin tilted slightly down, eyes lifted just enough to look warm but not weak. Her laughter landed gently, never too loud, never too real. Every movement rehearsed, every reaction refined. Ruth noticed early that Eleanor only relaxed when no one was watching. Which meant she was almost never relaxed. Eleanor's world was curated light. White walls, pale wood, glass surfaces that reflected perfection back at her. The house bent itself around her aesthetic, soft, expensive, fragile. Even the furniture looked like it was afraid of being used. Ruth cleaned Eleanor's spaces differently. Not because Eleanor asked. Because the rooms demanded it. The mirrors were everywhere. Hallway mirrors. Bathroom mirrors. Dressing room mirrors framed in gold and reassurance. Ruth wiped fingerprints from them daily, careful not to leave her own behind. She noticed how Eleanor approached mirrors cautiously, like they might say something unkind if caught at the wrong angle. How she adjusted herself before facing them. How she sometimes froze, staring too long, as if the reflection might blink first. The cameras loved Eleanor. Charity galas. Fundraisers. Interviews. She spoke about compassion with polished sincerity. About giving back. About lifting communities. Ruth stood just out of frame during those events, handing over coats, adjusting hems, holding purses that cost more than her monthly rent. She heard Eleanor's voice change the moment the cameras clicked off. The warmth evaporated. "What time is it? Where's Jonathan? Did I leave my phone upstairs?" "No, thank you." No acknowledgement. Not cruelty. Absence. Ruth learned that Eleanor wasn't unkind. She was hollow. Eleanor had secrets too. They were quieter than Jonathan's. More intimate. The kind that bled inward instead of outward. Ruth first noticed during late afternoons, when the house fell into a strange stillness. Eleanor would retreat to her bedroom, door closed, shades half drawn. Ruth would hear the sound of drawers opening, closing, opening again. One day, while organizing the dressing room, Ruth found a pill bottle tucked behind silk scarves. Not prescription painkillers. Something stronger. Eleanor never abused them. She rationed them. Control was important to her. Ruth put the bottle back exactly where it was. She never mentioned it. Later, Eleanor began asking Ruth for favors that weren't tasks. Do I look tired? Be honest, does this make me look old? Jonathan says I worry too much. Do you think I do? Questions slipped out when Eleanor was exhausted. When the performance slipped, Ruth answered carefully. Truth softened by safety. No, ma'am. You look fine. I think you carry a lot. Eleanor nodded at that last one, eyes distant. She didn't ask Ruth how she knew. Some truths recognize each other. The affair happened quietly. It didn't begin with passion. It began with loneliness. Ruth knew because Eleanor didn't bother hiding the signs. A different perfume. A sudden interest in afternoons away. Phone calls taken in the car, voice low and unsteady. One morning, Eleanor asked Ruth to drive. Just once. Her hands trembled as she put on earrings. Her reflection didn't comfort her today. They drove across town in silence. Eleanor gave directions without explanation. They stopped in front of a boutique hotel that advertised discretion more than luxury. Eleanor didn't look at Ruth as she got out. I'll be about an hour. Ruth nodded. She waited in the car. An hour became 2. Ruth watched people come and go. Couples pretending not to know each other. Men in suits with wedding rings they never removed. When Eleanor returned, her makeup was perfect. Her eyes were not. She sat in the passenger seat, stared forward, and whispered, I'm not a bad person. Ruth kept her eyes on the road. I know. Eleanor let out a sound that might have been relief. Or grief. That was the beginning of something dangerous. Not the affair. The dependency. Eleanor began leaning on Ruth in small, almost invisible ways. Lingering in rooms when Ruth was there. Asking her opinion more often. Confiding things that should have stayed locked away. I don't think Jonathan sees me anymore, she said once, adjusting flowers that didn't need adjusting. I used to be interesting, she said another time, staring at old photos. Do you ever feel like you're fading? She asked softly, almost embarrassed. Ruth listened. Always listened. But she never crossed the line Eleanor kept inching toward. Because Ruth understood power dynamics. Understood that intimacy without equality was a trap. Eleanor's sadness was real. But so was her privilege. And Ruth had learned never to confuse the two. The cameras kept smiling. Eleanor hosted luncheons about women's empowerment while shrinking inside her own home. She posed for photos beside Jonathan, her hand resting lightly on his arm, like she was afraid to leave fingerprints. Jonathan didn't know about the affair. Or maybe he did. Men like Jonathan didn't need to know everything to feel in control. Eleanor's guilt gnawed at her. It softened her edges in public and sharpened them in private. She snapped at staff over nothing. Apologized later with gift cards instead of words. One afternoon, she accused Ruth of misplacing a necklace. Her voice was tight. Accusatory. Ruth didn't react. She waited. Minutes later, Eleanor found it exactly where she'd left it. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean." "It's all right, ma'am," Ruth replied. But something shifted. Trust cracked. Not because of the accusation. Because of how easily it came. Eleanor smiled for cameras because she was terrified of what would happen if she didn't. She believed exposure would destroy her. She didn't understand that concealment already was. Ruth saw the pattern clearly now. Jonathan's power crushed outward. Eleanor's power collapsed inward. Both left wreckage. And Ruth stood between them, absorbing the impact quietly. She noticed how Eleanor watched Jonathan during dinner. How she measured her words. How she flinched, not physically, but emotionally, when he dismissed her opinions. Ruth noticed because she knew that flinch. She'd seen it in women who learned early that disagreement came at a cost. One night, Eleanor drank too much wine. The kind of night that stripped polish away. She found Ruth in the kitchen, cleaning. "I envy you," Eleanor said suddenly. Ruth paused. "Why is that, ma'am?" "You know who you are," Eleanor said, tears welling unexpectedly. "I don't think I ever did." Ruth wanted to say something honest. Something dangerous. But honesty wasn't safe here. So she said nothing. Eleanor wiped her eyes and laughed weakly. "Forget I said that." Ruth didn't forget. She catalogued it. Because every confession was a crack. And cracks spread. Eleanor's affair ended quietly. Guilt won. Fear followed. She threw herself into charity work harder than ever, chasing absolution through applause. The pills stayed. The mirrors stayed. The smile sharpened. Ruth understood then that Eleanor's greatest fear wasn't being caught. It was being seen. And Ruth had seen her. Fully. Without illusion. That knowledge settled into Ruth's chest, not as leverage, but as weight. She didn't want power. But she understood it. Power wasn't about control. It was about knowing where people were most fragile. And Eleanor Hale was fragile everywhere she pretended to be strong. On the night Ruth realized this fully, she stood alone in Eleanor's dressing room, lights low, mirrors glowing softly. She caught her own reflection. Centered. Still. Invisible, yet present. And for the first time, Ruth understood something that made her breath hitch. If this family ever turned on her. If loyalty ever failed. She wouldn't need to raise her voice. She wouldn't need to threaten. All she'd have to do was stop protecting them. Ruth turned off the lights and closed the door gently. The smile Eleanor showed the world remained intact. For now. The son who was never self-made. Lucas Hale liked to tell people he'd earned everything. He said it casually, the way people do when they've never had to prove it. His confidence was effortless, inherited, stitched into him long before he understood what the word work actually meant. Ruth noticed that people who were truly self-made never talked about it. Lucas talked about it constantly. He walked through the mansion like it was temporary housing. Like the world beyond its walls was waiting for him, impressed already. He never thanked anyone properly. Gratitude, to him, was a formality, not a feeling. "Ruth," he'd say, snapping his fingers lightly, "can you?" "Never, please." Never when you have a moment. Just expectation. Ruth responded the same way she always did. Calm. Efficient. Unremarkable. Lucas mistook that for indifference. Or worse, agreement. He brought friends home often. Loud voices, careless laughter, shoes kicked off on expensive rugs. He spoke freely around Ruth, assuming she couldn't possibly matter to the story he was telling. He bragged about college the most. Stanford. He liked the way it landed in conversations. The respect it demanded. He wore it like armor. Ruth remembered the summer before Lucas left for college. Jonathan had taken more calls than usual. Late nights. Closed doors. Voices lowered not out of secrecy, but efficiency. One call stood out. "I don't care what it costs," Jonathan said. "It needs to disappear. You promised this wouldn't become a problem." Ruth stood in the hallway, hands folded, breathing shallow. Disappearing problems rarely meant solving them. A week later, Lucas returned from a party with a smile too wide and eyes too glassy. He laughed loudly at dinner, clinking his glass, telling stories that skipped important details. Ruth noticed the way Eleanor watched him that night. The tightness around her mouth. The way Jonathan cut Lucas off mid-sentence with a look. That look said, "Not here." Later, Ruth overheard Eleanor crying softly in the kitchen. "I thought we raised him better," she whispered. Jonathan didn't respond. Silence, again. Lucas left for college as planned. The incident, whatever it was, vanished. That's how Ruth learned the difference between accountability and insulation. Lucas was insulated. He returned home during breaks with sharper edges. More confidence. Less restraint. He treated the mansion staff like props in a story where he was always the lead. Ruth saw the way he looked at women. The way charm turned transactional when it didn't get him what he wanted. The way rejection confused him, not because it hurt, but because it contradicted his expectations. He once cornered Ruth in the pantry. Not physically. Socially. "You've been here forever, right?" he asked, leaning against the shelves. "Yes, sir." "Must be nice," he said, smirking. "Knowing exactly where you belong." The words were light. The meaning was not. Ruth met his eyes calmly. "I know where I am," she said. "That's different." Lucas laughed, dismissing it. He always dismissed things that didn't flatter him. He didn't know he'd been catalogued. The scandal resurfaced years later. Not publicly. Privately. A legal letter arrived while Lucas was away. Ruth didn't read it, but she saw Jonathan's reaction. The tightening jaw. The immediate phone calls. The tone he used only when something threatened the family's image. "I thought this was handled. We can't let this come out now. Settle it. Settle it." Ruth understood the word by now. It meant silence purchased. It meant pain absorbed by someone without resources to fight back. Lucas came home early that break. Quieter. Watchful. Cowardice shows itself not in fear, but in avoidance. He avoided eye contact. Avoided rooms where conversations might turn sharp. He drank more. Laughed louder. Postured harder. Ruth noticed how he flinched when his phone buzzed. How his confidence frayed when he thought he was alone. One night, she overheard him arguing with Jonathan. "I didn't do anything wrong," Lucas insisted. "You did something careless," Jonathan corrected. "You always do." Lucas's voice cracked. "You said this would never follow me." Jonathan's voice was ice. "Nothing follows you if you don't let it." Ruth stood still, heart heavy. This was the inheritance Jonathan truly passed down. Not wealth. Not opportunity. Impunity. Lucas learned that consequences were optional. That mistakes could be erased if you were valuable enough. That women's pain could be negotiated down to numbers. It didn't make him confident. It made him empty. Ruth saw the hollowness grow. He tried to fill it with success stories that weren't his. With arrogance that required constant reinforcement. With cruelty disguised as humor. He spoke dismissively about employees. About people who complain. About false accusations. False. The word landed wrong every time. Ruth wondered if Lucas believed his own lies, or if repeating them was the only way he could sleep. One afternoon, Madeline confronted him in the hallway. "You know she didn't lie," she said quietly. Lucas froze. "Don't," he snapped. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know you," Madeline replied. Ruth stood nearby, pretending to organize a shelf. She heard everything. Lucas stormed off. Madeline didn't cry. She never did when the truth hurt. Lucas's entitlement made him reckless. He started assuming protection would always come. That the world would bend the way his family always had. He spoke more freely again. Took more risks. That's when Ruth realized something unsettling. Lucas didn't just rely on the system. He underestimated it. Systems protect power, but only while it's useful. And Lucas was beginning to look like a liability. Ruth began to see the outline of something inevitable. Jonathan's empire was clean because he controlled it. Lucas was messy. Eleanor could smile through pain. Jonathan could bury bodies metaphorically. Lucas leaked. He treated silence like a given instead of a gift. One night, drunk, he spoke too loudly in the living room with friends. "My dad can make anything go away," he said, laughing. "That's real power." Ruth stood in the kitchen, hands gripping the counter. Something shifted in her chest. Not anger. Recognition. This family didn't just exploit systems. They taught the next generation to do the same, without even the discipline of caution. Ruth thought of the woman whose life had been altered forever. The one whose name never reached newspapers. The one whose truth had been negotiated down. Ruth had never met her. But she carried her. Carried her like she carried every unseen cost in that house. That night, Ruth sat alone after everyone slept. She didn't plan. She reflected. For years, she'd believed loyalty meant endurance. Silence. Protection. But Lucas was different. Jonathan harmed from distance. Eleanor harmed from weakness. Lucas harmed from entitlement. And entitlement spread. Ruth felt the weight of every secret she'd kept press heavier against her ribs. For the first time, she asked herself a dangerous question. What does loyalty become when it protects harm? The question didn't demand an answer. It simply refused to leave. Ruth understood then that her reckoning wouldn't come from rage. It would come from clarity. From recognizing the moment silence stopped being neutral. Lucas Hale would never call himself cruel. Men like him never did. They called themselves unlucky. Misunderstood. Targeted. And they relied on women like Ruth to clean up after them. That was the inheritance he assumed she'd accept. He was wrong. Ruth didn't know yet what she would do. She only knew this. When the time came, she wouldn't act out of revenge. She would act out of responsibility. Because someone had to. And because silence, her greatest skill, was also her greatest power. The daughter who knows the truth. Madeline Hale was never loud enough for her family. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood too early that saying it would cost her. She moved through the mansion differently than the others. Slower. More deliberate. As if she were always listening for something just beyond hearing. Ruth noticed that about her right away. Madeline lingered. She lingered in doorways after conversations ended. In hallways where arguments had dissolved into politeness. In rooms that felt heavy even after people left. She wasn't lost. She was observing. As a child, Madeline had learned the value of silence the hard way. She'd tried honesty once, asked her father why families had to leave their homes so his buildings could rise. Jonathan had smiled indulgently and told her she was too young to understand how the world worked. Eleanor had smoothed it over with a hug that didn't quite land. Lucas had laughed. Madeline never asked again. But she never stopped noticing. She saw how her mother rehearsed happiness before events. How her father's phone calls changed his posture. How Lucas's charm sharpened into something brittle when he didn't get his way. And she saw Ruth. Really saw her. Ruth wasn't just part of the background to Madeline. She was part of the structure. The steady presence that made chaos look orderly. The one person who didn't pretend the house was something it wasn't. Madeline used to watch Ruth clean as a child. The way her movements were precise, economical. The way she listened more than she spoke. The way she seemed anchored. It comforted her. When Madeline grew older, she started asking Ruth small questions. Safe ones. Do you think people can change? Do you ever miss places you've left? Is it possible to love something and still know it's wrong? Ruth answered carefully. Not evasively. But responsibly. Madeline noticed the difference. She learned that Ruth spoke truth without cruelty. Honesty without exposure. That kind of integrity stood out in a house built on performance. Madeline's secret was not scandalous. It was dangerous. She knew. She knew about her father's deals, not in detail, but in shape. She'd read between lines. Overheard conversations. Recognized the patterns Ruth had catalogued long before. She knew her mother was deeply unhappy. Not just bored or restless, but fractured. The pills. The drinking. The careful avoidance of herself. She knew about Lucas. She didn't know every detail, but she knew enough. She knew the look in his eyes when he denied things too quickly. The way Jonathan intervened too fast. The way Eleanor flinched at the mention of lawsuits or headlines. And she knew Henry was not okay. Madeline carried this knowledge quietly. Not because she was weak. Because she was strategic. She understood something her family didn't. Truth without power is just pain. And Madeline had very little power. Ruth saw the weight Madeline carried in her shoulders. In the way she spoke carefully, choosing words like she was navigating a minefield. One afternoon, Madeline found Ruth in the garden. You've seen things, Madeline said suddenly. Ruth didn't look up. Yes, miss. More than most people, Madeline added. Ruth paused. I've been here a long time. Madeline swallowed. Does it ever feel wrong? Staying quiet? Ruth met her eyes then. Sometimes, she said. It depends why you're quiet. Madeline nodded slowly. That was the first real conversation they had. Not about chores. Not about logistics. About ethics. After that, Madeline began gravitating toward Ruth instinctively. Sitting in the kitchen while Ruth worked. Helping without being asked. Sharing space without demanding attention. It wasn't rebellion. It was alignment. Madeline didn't idolize Ruth. She respected her. And respect, in that house, was rare. Madeline studied art, but not the kind people expected. She gravitated toward pieces that depicted discomfort. Rawness. Faces that weren't flattering. She said once, half joking, "I like art that doesn't lie." Jonathan hated that. "Why would you want ugliness on your walls?" he asked. Madeline didn't answer. Ruth noticed which paintings Madeline kept hidden in her room. Which ones faced the wall when company came. She noticed how Madeline wrote in journals she never shared. How she documented emotions like evidence. Ruth recognized the instinct. Madeline wasn't collecting secrets. She was preserving truth. One evening, after another argument between Jonathan and Eleanor, Madeline knocked on the staff door. Ruth opened it, surprised. "Can I come in?" Madeline asked quietly. Ruth hesitated. "Yes." Madeline sat at the small table, hands folded. "I don't think I belong here," she said. Ruth waited. "In this family," Madeline clarified. "I see things. And when I say them out loud, I'm told I'm dramatic. Or ungrateful. Or confused." Ruth nodded slowly. "That happens when truth makes people uncomfortable." Madeline looked at her with a mixture of relief and fear. "Am I wrong?" she asked. "No," Ruth said. "You're early." That answer landed deep. Madeline exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for years. From that night on, something unspoken formed between them. Not conspiracy. Understanding. Madeline began noticing Ruth noticing her. The glances exchanged when Jonathan deflected questions. The shared silences when Eleanor performed joy. The careful way Ruth positioned herself near Henry during tense dinners. Madeline saw it all. And she understood then that Ruth was not passive. She was deliberate. That realization changed everything. Madeline stopped trying to confront her family directly. She learned restraint. Learned timing. Learned observation. She learned from Ruth without Ruth ever teaching her. One night, Madeline asked, "Do you think silence can be ethical?" Ruth considered. "Silence can be protection," she said. "But only for so long." Madeline nodded. That was the moment alliance formed. Not spoken. Felt. Madeline's power wasn't money. Or authority. It was clarity. And clarity, when paired with patience, was dangerous. Ruth began to see her future reflected in Madeline, and her past too. A woman learning too early that truth wasn't welcomed. That empathy was often punished. Ruth didn't want Madeline to become hardened. But she wanted her to survive. One afternoon, Madeline handed Ruth a sketch. It was of the mansion. Cracked down the middle. "You see it too," Ruth said softly. Madeline smiled, not happily, but knowingly. "Yes." That smile lingered with Ruth long after Madeline left. For the first time, Ruth realized she was not alone. And that changed the shape of her reckoning. Because power didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it formed quietly. Between two women who refused to lie to themselves. The quiet boy upstairs. Henry Hale learned early that silence could keep you alive. Not the dramatic kind of alive, the kind where you still breathed, but the quieter version. The kind where nothing broke too loudly. The kind where attention passed you by. He was the youngest, and that made him both protected and forgotten. Ruth noticed him because he didn't move like a child who felt safe. He moved like someone calculating risk. Henry's room was at the end of the hallway upstairs. Far enough from the others to feel separate. Close enough to hear everything. The worst possible position. Ruth passed his door every day. She knew his routines. How the light stayed on late. How food trays came back barely touched. How he flinched at sudden noises, not visibly, but internally. A pause. A breath held too long. Jonathan called Henry sensitive. Eleanor called him shy. Lucas barely noticed him at all. Ruth saw something else. Hyper-awareness. Henry didn't trust the house. He didn't trust quiet. He didn't trust smiles that arrived too quickly or voices that dropped too low. He trusted patterns. And patterns had taught him to be careful. It started with small things. Correcting Henry's posture at dinner. Critiquing his tone when he spoke. Reminding him, constantly, of expectations. Jonathan never yelled at Henry. That was the cruelty. He spoke calmly. Precisely. With the authority of a man who believed he was shaping something valuable. You need to be stronger, he'd say. You embarrass yourself when you hesitate. Men in this family don't shrink. Henry shrank anyway. Because strength, as Jonathan defined it, required erasing parts of yourself. Ruth saw it in the way Henry avoided eye contact. In how he folded himself smaller in rooms. In how he waited for permission that never came. One night, Ruth found Henry sitting on the stairs after midnight. He startled when he saw her. Sorry, he said immediately. For existing. You didn't do anything wrong, Ruth said gently. He nodded, but didn't move. Ruth sat a few steps away. Not too close. Can't sleep, she asked. Henry shrugged. Too loud, he said. The house was silent. Ruth understood. The noise he meant didn't come from outside. They sat like that for a while. Eventually, Henry spoke. Do you ever feel like, if you say the wrong thing, something bad will happen? Ruth chose her words carefully. Yes, she said. I do. That was enough. After that, Henry started seeking Ruth out subtly. Lingering in the kitchen doorway. Sitting quietly while she worked. Asking for things he didn't need, just to stay nearby. Ruth didn't ask why. She didn't need to. The first sign came accidentally. Ruth was cleaning Henry's room while he was at school. She moved carefully, respecting his space more than anyone else's. She noticed how everything was arranged with intention. Books aligned. Desk cleared. A sense of control imposed on chaos. When she reached under the bed, her hand brushed against something solid. A small recorder. She froze. Not because she was afraid. Because she understood immediately. She didn't touch it again. She didn't move it. She put everything back exactly as it was. When Henry came home that afternoon, he hovered in the doorway while Ruth finished up. You can tell me if I did something wrong, he said quickly. Ruth looked at him. You didn't, she said. He swallowed. Are you sure? Yes. Something in her tone settled him. That night, Henry knocked softly on the staff door. Ruth opened it. He held the recorder in his hands. I didn't know if you saw, he said, voice shaking. I did, Ruth replied. He flinched. She continued, I didn't listen. His shoulders dropped, just a little. I don't record everything, he said quickly. Just when he comes into my room. Or when he talks to me alone. Ruth felt something cold settle in her chest. How long? She asked. Henry hesitated. 2 years. 2 years. 2 years of quiet endurance. Of documentation. Of living in a state of constant readiness. What does he say? Ruth asked gently. Henry's eyes filled, but he didn't cry. He tells me I'm weak, he said. That I'll ruin everything if I don't toughen up. That people like me get eaten alive. Ruth closed her eyes for a moment. This wasn't discipline. This was erosion. And you record it, she said, not a question. Henry nodded. So I remember I'm not imagining it, he whispered. So if I ever need to prove it. Prove it. The word broke something open inside Ruth. She knelt in front of him, careful to stay in his line of sight. You shouldn't have to prove pain, she said. But I understand why you do. Henry looked at her like she'd handed him something precious. You won't tell, right? He asked. If he knows, it'll get worse. I won't tell, Ruth said. And she meant it. But in her chest, the weight of silence shifted. This was no longer about loyalty. This was about protection. Henry trusted her because she had never betrayed him. Because she had never dismissed his fear. Because she had never told him to be smaller or stronger or different. Ruth realized then how dangerous this secret was. Not just to Jonathan. To the entire family. If the recordings ever surfaced, they would shatter the image Eleanor worked so hard to maintain. They would expose Jonathan not as a visionary, but as a tyrant in private. They would force Lucas to confront what kind of legacy he was inheriting. And they would put Henry at risk. Ruth understood the calculus immediately. Truth had consequences. And children paid first. She began watching Jonathan more closely. The way he isolated Henry. The way he corrected him in front of others just enough to humiliate, not enough to draw attention. The way he framed cruelty as preparation. Ruth also noticed something else. Jonathan was careful. He didn't know Henry was recording, but he suspected something was off. His control tightened. His words became sharper, more deliberate. Predators sensed resistance even when they couldn't name it. Ruth started positioning herself strategically. Entering rooms at the right moment. Creating interruptions. Being present when Jonathan preferred privacy. She made herself visible. Jonathan noticed. You don't need to be up here so often, he said once, irritation slipping through. I'm just doing my job, Ruth replied calmly. He studied her. Something passed between them. Recognition. Not of guilt. Of threat. That night, Ruth sat alone in her room, the recorder heavy in her thoughts. This wasn't a secret she could simply carry. This was a fire. Contained, for now. But fire spreads. Ruth thought about Madeline. About how she already knew something was wrong. About how she protected Henry in quiet ways, offering excuses, redirecting attention. Ruth thought about Eleanor, about her blindness and her fragility. And she thought about Jonathan. About how men like him didn't stop. They escalated. Ruth understood then that her reckoning was no longer theoretical. It had a deadline. She didn't know when. But she knew it was coming. And when it did, she would have to choose between the safety of one child and the collapse of an empire. Silence had kept Henry alive. For now. But silence was starting to look like surrender. Ruth turned off the light and lay still. Listening. Waiting. Because sometimes, the most dangerous secrets are not the ones that expose power, but the ones that reveal who it's already hurting. Loyalty has an expiration date. Ruth began to feel it before she could name it. A shift. Not dramatic. Not obvious. Just a subtle change in the way the house breathed around her. Doors closed a little faster. Conversations lowered sooner. Glances held a second too long. The mansion had always been full of secrets, but now, it was full of suspicion. Jonathan stopped making eye contact with her. Not entirely. Just enough to notice. Eleanor grew distant in a way that wasn't hollow this time, but defensive. Her smile stayed intact, but her warmth evaporated. She began double-checking rooms Ruth had already cleaned. Reorganizing drawers unnecessarily. Lucas watched Ruth the way careless men do when they start worrying about witnesses. Only Madeline noticed the pattern forming. Henry felt it too. His movements became sharper, more alert. He stopped leaving his room unless necessary. The recorder never left his pocket. Ruth said nothing. She had learned that silence wasn't absence, it was preparation. The first accusation came wrapped in politeness. Eleanor approached Ruth one afternoon while she was folding linens. "Ruth," she said lightly, "have you noticed anything missing lately?" Ruth looked up. "No, ma'am." Eleanor smiled, but her eyes didn't. "Well, a bracelet seems to have disappeared." "It's probably nothing." "Probably." Ruth nodded. "Let me know if I can help." Eleanor hesitated, then waved it off. "Of course. I didn't mean to imply." "You didn't," Ruth said calmly. But the implication had already landed. That night, Jonathan called a family meeting. Ruth knew because the house changed its posture when Jonathan took control. Chairs aligned. Lights adjusted. Voices hushed. She wasn't invited. She wasn't meant to be. But walls carried sound. "Things have been feeling unstable lately," Jonathan said. "We need to tighten up. We can't afford vulnerabilities." Vulnerabilities. Ruth felt the word settle uncomfortably. Lucas scoffed. "You're being paranoid." Jonathan snapped his head toward him. "I'm being cautious." Madeline spoke quietly. "About what?" Jonathan paused. "Trust." The word hung heavy. Eleanor said nothing. Henry didn't speak at all. Over the next few days, things escalated quietly. A drawer left open and blamed on Ruth. A pantry shelf misplaced. A cash envelope Eleanor swore was fuller the day before. Small things. Individually meaningless. Together, narrative. Ruth felt the walls narrowing. She understood what was happening long before anyone said it out loud. This family was preparing a sacrifice. Not because Ruth had done anything wrong. Because they needed reassurance. Power reassures itself by punishing proximity. Jonathan couldn't control markets. Or scandals. Or the slow erosion of his carefully managed life. But he could control Ruth. She was close enough to know too much. Invisible enough to be blamed. Disposable enough to remove. The irony didn't escape her. 17 years of loyalty reduced to convenience. Madeline confronted Eleanor quietly. "You're not really thinking this, are you?" she asked. Eleanor's voice trembled. "I don't know what to think anymore." "Then think," Madeline snapped. "Don't let him decide for you." Eleanor looked away. Fear always sounded like reason when it wore wealth. Jonathan made the accusation formal 3 days later. He called Ruth into his study. Alone. That was intentional. The room felt colder than usual. The award stared down like witnesses trained to forget. Ruth, Jonathan began calmly, we've had some concerns. Ruth stood still. Yes, sir. Items have gone missing. Small things, but repeated. Ruth met his eyes evenly. I haven't taken anything. Jonathan nodded slowly, as if he'd expected that answer. I believe you believe that, he said. The words landed sharp. Belief without trust was accusation dressed as empathy. You've been here a long time, he continued. Long enough to know how things work. Yes. And long enough to grow, comfortable. Comfortable. Ruth felt the shift then. This wasn't about missing items. This was about control. Are you accusing me? She asked quietly. Jonathan leaned back. I'm saying we need to be careful. With me, Ruth clarified. With everyone, he replied smoothly. A lie polished to reflect fairness. He slid a folder across the desk. Inside were receipts. Inventories. Notes. A story already written. We'll be conducting an internal review, Jonathan said. Until then, it might be best if you took some time away. Unpaid. Temporary. Undefined. Ruth closed the folder gently. You're letting me go. Jonathan smiled thinly. Let's not dramatize. She nodded. May I say something? He gestured graciously. 17 years, Ruth said. I've protected this family. In ways you don't even realize. Jonathan's eyes hardened just a fraction. That's exactly the problem, he said. There it was. She wasn't fired for theft. She was fired for knowledge. Eleanor didn't come see Ruth that day. Lucas avoided her completely. Henry stood frozen at the top of the stairs, watching silently. Madeline followed Ruth to the staff entrance. This is wrong, she whispered. Ruth met her gaze. I know. They can't do this. They already have. Madeline swallowed hard. I'm sorry. Ruth placed a hand over hers. This isn't your fault. But something had changed. The silence Ruth had carried for years was no longer neutral. It had been weaponized against her. That night, Ruth packed quietly. She moved through the house one last time, not as an employee, but as a witness. She noticed everything. The cracks in the walls. The tension in the air. The fear beneath the polish. She paused outside Henry's room. He opened the door immediately. They're blaming you, he said, voice shaking. Because of me? Ruth knelt in front of him. No, she said firmly. Because of them. He clutched the recorder. I can stop, he whispered. I can erase it. Ruth shook her head. Never erase the truth, she said. Just be careful where you keep it. He nodded, tears slipping free. You're the only one who believed me. Ruth's voice softened. I still do. When she reached the door, Eleanor finally appeared. She looked small. I didn't stop him, Eleanor said. I should have. Ruth studied her. Yes, she said simply. No anger. Just fact. That hurt more. Jonathan didn't come say goodbye. Men like him never did. They erased people by pretending they'd already disappeared. Ruth stepped outside with her box of belongings. 17 years condensed into cardboard. The door closed behind her. And with it, the illusion that loyalty protected anyone. As Ruth walked down the driveway, something inside her settled, not broke. Settled. She understood now. Silence had an expiration date. And hers had just passed. What came next wouldn't be revenge. It would be responsibility. Because once loyalty is betrayed, truth stops being optional. And the woman who sees everything eventually decides to be seen. When the invisible woman speaks. Ruth did not speak immediately. That was the first thing that unsettled them. People expected rage when they betrayed loyalty. Tears. Accusations. Public collapse. Something dramatic enough to reassure them they'd been right to fear you. Ruth gave them nothing. She left the mansion quietly and rented a small apartment across town. Clean. Plain. Safe. A place where silence belonged to her again. For the first time in 17 years, she slept without listening for other people's footsteps. But silence was no longer her shield. It was her instrument. Ruth understood something now with painful clarity. Truth, unleashed without care, destroyed the innocent first. And she refused to let Henry be collateral. So she planned, not out of anger, but out of obligation. The first call she made was not to a lawyer. It was to Madeline. "I need you to listen," Ruth said calmly. Madeline didn't interrupt. Ruth told her everything she could safely tell. Not details that would endanger Henry, but patterns. Behaviors. The shape of truth without its most fragile center exposed. Madeline went very quiet. "They blamed you because you know," she said finally. "Yes. And because you're replaceable to them." "Yes." Madeline's voice hardened. "You're not." That was when Ruth knew. She wasn't alone anymore. The second step was distance. Ruth did not go to the media. Not yet. Noise diluted power. Attention scattered responsibility. Instead, she went to places that respected documentation. She gathered what she had without stealing a single thing. Her memory. Dates. Timelines. Conversations overheard. Names repeated. She wrote everything down for the first time in her life. Not emotionally. Precisely. Facts didn't require tone. She remembered what Jonathan had never considered, that invisibility was an advantage. No one had watched her leave with anything. No one had checked her bags. Because no one believed she had anything worth taking. Jonathan felt it first. Not fear. Discomfort. Deals slowed. Calls went unanswered. Meetings postponed without explanation. Nothing he could point to. Just friction. He blamed market shifts. Political instability. Bad timing. Ruth smiled to herself when she heard. Power always blamed weather before accountability. Eleanor felt it next. A charity board requested additional documentation for a partnership. Questions surfaced. Soft ones. Polite ones. Just standard due diligence, they said. Eleanor's hands trembled as she signed papers. Lucas noticed it when a former connection stopped returning messages. When invitations thinned. When his reputation, always borrowed, began to feel fragile. He lashed out. Someone always did. Madeline visited Ruth in her new apartment. "You're doing something," she said. Yes. Is it dangerous? It's careful. Madeline nodded. What do you need from me? Ruth met her eyes. Truth, she said. At the right moment. Madeline didn't hesitate. Tell me when. Henry reached out through Madeline. He didn't speak. He sent a message. I still have it. Ruth stared at the screen for a long time. Then she replied. Keep it safe. You don't owe anyone your pain. That was the line she would not cross. Ruth's power was not exposure. It was control. She understood something now that Jonathan never would. The most devastating revelations were not loud. They were irrefutable. She contacted an independent investigator quietly. Someone who didn't care about headlines. Someone who followed threads patiently. She didn't accuse. She suggested. You might want to look here, she said. And here. And notice who always benefits. Names reappeared. Patterns confirmed. Nothing traced back to her. She watched from a distance as Jonathan's world tightened. Not collapsed. Tightened. That was intentional. Collapse invited chaos. Tightening forced reflection. Forced mistakes. Jonathan made one. He confronted Madeline. You've been talking to her, he said. Madeline didn't deny it. She didn't steal anything, Madeline said evenly. That's not the point. It is, Madeline replied. Jonathan's voice rose. She's trying to destroy this family. Madeline held his gaze. No, she said. She's protecting the truth you refuse to. That was the first time anyone had said it to his face. Eleanor overheard. Something in her broke. That night, Eleanor called Ruth. Her voice was small. I'm scared, she said. Ruth listened. I should have stopped him, Eleanor whispered. I should have protected my children. Yes, Ruth replied. Eleanor sobbed. Ruth did not comfort her. Comfort wasn't honesty. What do I do? Eleanor asked. Ruth chose her words carefully. You decide who you are when no one is watching. The line stayed with Eleanor. Days later, Eleanor asked for a separation. Jonathan was stunned. Power never anticipated consequences inside its own house. Lucas panicked. He tried to reach Ruth. She didn't answer. Some conversations had expired. The final move was not public. It was surgical. Ruth delivered her documentation to the right hands, quietly, legally, cleanly. Regulators. Oversight committees. People whose job was to notice patterns. Jonathan's empire didn't explode. It bled. Projects delayed. Permits revoked. Deals frozen pending review. He was still wealthy. But he was no longer untouchable. And that terrified him more than loss. Henry's recordings were never released. They didn't need to be. The threat of their existence was enough to ensure Jonathan never entered that room alone again. Ruth never told Henry that. He didn't need to know how powerful he already was. Months later, Ruth ran into Eleanor at a cafe. Eleanor looked older. More real. I owe you, Eleanor said. Ruth shook her head. You owe your children. Eleanor nodded. Madeline visited Ruth often. They talked about art. About ethics. About what it meant to witness harm without becoming it. You changed everything, Madeline said once. Ruth smiled softly. No, she said. I stopped pretending I was powerless. Jonathan never spoke to Ruth again. But he felt her. In every delay. Every unanswered call. Every door that no longer opened automatically. That was justice enough. Ruth didn't reclaim her old life. She built a new one. One where silence was chosen, not enforced. One where invisibility was a skill, not a sentence. The woman who saw everything had finally spoken. Not with anger. With precision. And the world listened. Because truth, when handled with care, always finds its way to the surface. Ruth's story is a reminder, loyalty has a price, and sometimes the truth only finds power when the invisible finally speaks. In the shadows of wealth and privilege, the real strength belongs to those who see and endure. If you were captivated by this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell. Here on Brinicle Reads, we bring you tales that linger long after the last word, stories of betrayal, resilience, and secrets revealed. Until next time, stay curious, and watch closely, because every story hides a truth waiting to be uncovered.